Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Rabbi Ruti Regan. This is our Matan webinar on inclusion and pride for Pride Month, on the intersection and overlap between Jewish LGBTQ advocacy and Jewish disability advocacy, because we've got to do both together for any number of reasons. And so, as usual, basic ground rules. I really want and welcome questions. You can ask questions in the chat box at any time. I'll be paying attention to the chat box and weave in answers to questions as we go. And you can also reach me at rabbi@matankids.org. We like questions, so please ask them. And on the most basic level, we've got to do, in order to build the Jewish community that is as we want it to be, we have to do LGBTQ advocacy because some Jews are LGBTQ. Some Jews are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, asexual, questioning any number of other identities. And we can't build a Jewish community that holds all of our people without acknowledging that. Likewise, some Jews are disabled. Therefore, we have to build a community that holds space for that. Some Jews are LGBTQ and disabled because one does not prevent the other. And, before I go any further, just a little curious about who's in the room. So I'm going to launch a poll asking about identities. Just going to take like a minute for that. And if you don't want to answer, that's fine, but if you do, I appreciate it. All right, so thank you very much to those who participated in the poll. Looks like most people identify as Jewish, some people identify as LGBTQ, some people identify as disabled or having a disability or chronic illness, some people identify as two of the above, one person identifies as none of the above. And I always, when I'm doing a webinar, like to assume presence of the groups that I'm talking about. And I think that's good practice for all of us, generally speaking. All right, so thank you, everyone. So some Jews are LGBTQ and disabled, and have a chronic illness. And it's not a rare thing. And in both categories, and especially in the overlap, I think that our goal in how we build communities should be that we want to build communities where we value our people, all of our people, as much as God does. And as individuals, we want to value all of our people as much as God does. One way I sometimes put this is that the Jewish community, the Torah, taught me that we're all created, B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. The disability community taught me how to mean it, in the sense of humanity is not something you have to earn. And the LGBTQ community taught me a lot about love embodiment and the importance of valuing and holding space for love and embodiment. So I think that this all ties together in ways that our communities need. But what it comes down to on some basic level is that regardless of how we act, LGBTQ Jews are part of the Jewish people, disabled Jews are part of the Jewish people, LGBTQ Jews with disabilities are part of the Jewish people, and our communities need to act accordingly because that's what community is about. And I think that we all affirm this on one level. We all want to value everyone. The problem is that we get into these situations where pluralism or unity, or however we're calling it, can end up being a competing goal with solidarity and holding space for disability and queerness or gayness or transness. Because when we tolerate homophobia or transphobia in the name of pluralism, we end up creating a hostile environment for LGBTQ Jews. When we tolerate ableism in the name of pluralism or tolerance, we end up creating a hostile environment for disabled Jews. And it's really hard for people who are both to find a community in which neither is tolerated, in which they're not expected to tolerate either. So I think that it's helpful as we're building communities to acknowledge that there are competing goals, and that sometimes there are sides, sometimes there are controversies, and sometimes these conversations and these commitments are going to put us in positions that are uncomfortable. And I think that whatever trade-offs and choices we're making, we need to realize that those are choices and own those choices and know what choices we're making and why. Or to put it another way, the only place that Jews are safe from anti-Semitism is Jewish community, right? Which means that if we within Jewish community discriminate against LGBTQ Jews or disabled Jews, or especially people who are both, then they have no place where they're safe. They have no place where they're valued. And that's a really dangerous situation. Or to put it another way, if we're not for ourselves, who will be? If we're not for our disabled LGBTQ members of our community, who will be for us? It's on us. And we can't afford to put people in the position of having to choose which of their identities will be valued, respected, and held, and which of their identities will cause them to be the targets of discrimination, because people are only one person at a time. Whatever people are, they're ours. So I want to look at some examples of how this can play out. So this is an example. So there's someone named Sarah. She's 13 years old. She's autistic. She doesn't speak or only speaks a few words. Has had a lot of trouble finding acceptance in Jewish community and getting access to Jewish education. She's finally found a youth group that really values her and doesn't see her autism or her speech disability as barriers to being a fully equal member of the community. But as she's gone through puberty and grown up, she's realizing that she's a lesbian. She likes women. And question that's going to arise for her is, if she comes out, is she still going to be welcome in the youth group? Is she still going to be treated equally? And how does she know that? The stakes are much higher for LGBTQ Jews who have already faced a lot of barriers to acceptance in Jewish community and may really only have access to one space they're welcome in as a disabled person. And this can happen in the other direction as well. Like, somebody might be very welcome in an LGBTQ youth group until they start asking for accommodations for their disability, or until they ask people to stop using ableist language. And we can't put people in the position of having to choose. We have to build educational and communal spaces where all of who people are is valued and welcome. So how do we do this? Well, in youth groups, a lot of us start the year, youth groups or camps, we might start the year by talking about group norms. When we're talking about group norms, it's really important to talk about slurs and to talk about respecting a broad range of identities. So just like we tell kids, you can't call people gay as an insult. You know, you can describe things as gay as an accurate adjective, but you can't use it as a pejorative. Similarly, it's not okay to call people the R word or to use disability as an insult. And the reason that's not okay is the same reason. There's nothing wrong with being gay. There's nothing wrong with being queer or trans. There's nothing wrong with having a disability. And if we use people's identity as an insult, we're hurting people, and we're hurting people who really need access to Jewish community. So it should be part of the same conversation about our group norms, about how we talk to each other, and about how we don't use people's identities as a pejorative. And you need to make sure that this is understood from the beginning, and that we enforce this rule. Because, you know, people won't necessarily follow it on its own, but it's our job as adults to guide the kids we're working with, and if we're teachers of adults, to guide the adults we're working with in, you know, appropriate learning and conduct towards one another. Another thing to remember, if we're talking about youth group, we're talking about teenagers of camp or older kids, is it's really important to remember that disability does not erase puberty. Most people, including most disabled people, are not asexual after puberty. Most people who've been through puberty feel romantic and sexual attraction. Disability doesn't prevent that. And one thing I've seen go wrong in a lot of youth settings is that people with disabilities, especially people who have or are perceived as having intellectual disabilities, get treated as much younger children. And people will joke about them having a crush on somebody, or them, you know, being in a relationship with somebody, or will interpret their expressions of attraction as cute. It's not cute. It's, you know, it's something that people their age do, and it's really not okay to treat somebody's sexuality or potential sexuality as a joke, because it's real, and it's just as real for disabled people as it is for anyone else. Related to that, disability does not erase gender identity. And it's important to keep in mind that you might think you know someone's gender. You might have a pretty good guess about what somebody's gender is, but sometimes we get it wrong. And even if you've known a kid since they were a baby, which in Jewish education we often do, you might have grown up, like watched someone grow up thinking of them as a girl, relating to them as a girl forever, for a really long time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a girl or a boy or whatever other gender we thought they were. Because ultimately, anything we say about someone else's gender is a guess. People are the experts on their own gender. And when people tell us what their gender is, we need to believe them. And a lot of times, people with disabilities are not believed. They're like assumed to not know what they're talking about or to be confused. But people with disabilities can have whatever, the full range of gender identities that anyone else does. And it seems within the autistic community, there hasn't been rigorous research on this, but it seems within the organized autistic community that the rate at which people are trans or have non-binary gender identities seems to be significantly higher than the general population. So it's important to just keep in mind that this is a possibility and be prepared to be respectful of it. Related to being age appropriate and respecting sexuality, so that teenagers with disabilities have the right to have their gender and sexuality respected and to express it in age appropriate ways, and to not be tolerated when they do things that are not appropriate boundaries for someone their age. And again, this is something that you need to watch closely with teenagers, because it's really common. It's a really common form of bullying for people to treat a disabled peer's sexuality as a joke or as a social experiment. Another thing that happens a lot that we need to really watch and correct is, like, say the popular football star will take a classmate with Down syndrome to the prom, and this will be treated as like this great act of mitzvah or chesed or charity or acceptance or something. But, you know, if somebody asks someone out, it's a date. And if somebody asks someone out in a way that is not respecting the fact that they're old enough to know what dating is and engage with it, that's not something to praise, that's a problem. As people's sexual and romantic capacity is not a joke, it's just a fact of life. So related to gender identity, people have the right to make choices about their own gender expression. And this, for people with disabilities, is often not respected in a number of directions. For instance, people with disabilities might be pushed really hard to engage in gender conforming behavior, but they also might be presumed not to need support in doing gendered things that other people their age do. And I did a webinar on how this affects girls in particular last year that might be of interest to people who want to explore this further. But people have the right to make their own choices about gender expression, whether that's gender conformity or whether it isn't, whether it's a range, whether we like it or not. That's very personal. And one way, again, I've seen this happen among girls, is that often non-disabled peers or presumed non-disabled peers will decide that they need to give their autistic peer a makeover so that she can look like everyone else and be included. And sometimes adults encourage this, and we shouldn't encourage this, because pushing makeup on someone who wants it, who doesn't want it, that's not friendship or inclusion, that's bullying. If somebody wants help with makeup, that's friendship, that's social inclusion. But pushing things on people who don't want it isn't friendship or inclusion, it's bullying. People have the right to be different. People have the right to make decisions about gender expression, and disability should not be seen as interfering with that. Similarly, it's really important to respect the privacy of teenagers. And when kids have disabilities, we often talk to their parents more than we might talk to parents of other kids the same age. And sometimes that's appropriate, but we also have to be a little careful about that, because there's some things that are private, and people need to know that we won't, if they come out to us, that doesn't mean we'll repeat it to their parents, because not all kids can come out to their parents safely. Not all kids are ready to come out to their parents. It's a really big risk. We're not in the best position to assess it. And if a kid knows that everything they say to us will be repeated to their parents, that means they can't come out to us either. And it's really important for kids who are gay, queer, trans, bisexual, lesbians, or think that they might be, who are questioning their identity, they really need to be safe, and they really need to be able to talk to adults who will support them, which means that we have to make it clear that we'll respect their privacy, and that we're not going to go ahead and repeat everything they say, and that we know that they and their parents are not the same person. It's really critical in supporting kids with disabilities, LGBTQ kids with disabilities, and any kid might be LGBTQ. We're not always going to know. We don't know unless they tell us. It's just as true for kids with disabilities as typically developing kids. Another way to send an inclusive message and to signal that we're safe and that this is a place where the totality of people who is welcome. So we need to think about what examples we're using in discussions. For instance, for using hypothetical scenarios to talk about Jewish values, make sure that it's not all straight people, it's not all non-disabled people, that sometimes it's LGBTQ people, sometimes it's disabled people, sometimes it's people who are both. And that we have like a full range of humanity, because that sends a message about how we're defining ourselves as a community, and that people will still be part of our community if they come out. If you're in a situation where you're doing a lot of quoting or assigning readings, think about what you're assigning. Are you assigning any LGBTQ Jews? Are you quoting them? Jews with disabilities, people who are both, etc.? When are you doing it? Are there ways to do it more? Because people need to hear it. So another type of example of how it's really important to attend to the fact that people can have both of these sets of identities is that it really hurts when you're in Jewish community and there's a pride speaker or someone else speaking on LGBTQ Jewish issues, and then they say or do really ableist things. So the example I have on my slides, so there's David, he's a trans adult, hasn't been to synagogue in a while. he decided to come for Pride Shabbat because there was going to be a trans speaker, and he really wanted to connect with that part of the Jewish community after having been kind of alienated for a while. And then, as it turned out, the speaker refused to use the microphone, which meant that David couldn't hear or understand anything they said. And if that kind of thing happens, someone's already kind of on the edge. How long is it going to be before he comes back, if he ever does? Or even if somebody is very embedded, it's a violation of trust that can take a long time to recover from as a community. A similar example to that is, say a synagogue holds a panel of LGBTQ speakers, maybe LGBTQ speakers who are members of that community in particular. One of the speakers on the panel says the R word, or says something else like really hateful of people with disabilities, and no one corrects them, no one pushes back on it. How are LGBTQ Jews, disabled Jews in the audience going to feel about how they were just described? I think that they're going to get the message that even in a space that's about pride, even in a space that's about acceptance and loving some of who they are, their Jewish community is still not going to speak up for them or insist that they be treated with respect. And when people hear that kind of message, it has consequences. And it has consequences that can be invisible because people don't talk to us about it or they don't come back. But this kind of thing really hurts. And I know this from talking to people who've been on the receiving end of it. So what do we do about this to build the kind of community we aspire to? Don't assume that things go without saying. When you invite speakers, work to make it clear to them what the standards are and be prepared to enforce it. They won't know if you don't tell them. And you can't assume that everybody who's basically a good person will follow your rules and share all of the values you're trying to build. So tell people ahead of time when you're negotiating that they have to use the microphone and it's not optional. Tell people, we don't use the R word. Fighting ableism is really important. And if it happens in the moment, correct it and be prepared to stand your ground, because sometimes there are going to be awkward moments. Sometimes it's going to be difficult, but it's much harder if we don't do it, and the cost of not doing it is high. So we have to have these conversations explicitly rather than assume it doesn't go without saying if we really want to build our whole community. Similarly, when you're planning LGBTQ programming, remember to ask about access needs. Remember that some people who really need access to that program need accommodations in order to get access to that program. So, plan for access, and sort of as general, I'm always on this soapbox. When you're promoting a program, make it clear what accessibility is being offered and who to contact with questions about accessibility, because that dramatically increases who can come. And even if nobody reaches out to you, people see it, and it makes a difference in how they're perceiving you and whether they're welcome. So an example of where this goes wrong is welcoming spaces that aren't. And this happens a lot to Jews with mobility issues. So say a synagogue wants to hold a potluck for Pride Shabbat, and they want to make sure it's maximally friendly. So they hold it in someone's home, but that person's home doesn't have a ramp, doesn't have an accessible bathroom, and LGBTQ wheelchair users or people who need scooters can't go upstairs, can't get in, can't go to the potluck. So in the name of friendliness and warmth, we're actually excluding some of the people who most need access to this space. And to the people who do have access to the space, the harm can be invisible and it can feel really warm and comforting. But we need to make sure we're being intentional about this and not doing this to people and not assuming people will speak up. We have to be proactive and intentional about this ourselves. And we can. We have the capacity to think about this and make better choices. So another example of how conversations in Jewish community can play out in ways that are harmful to LGBTQ Jews with disabilities is the way we talk about Jewish continuity sometimes only values certain kinds. We send implicit messages a lot about who we're imagining as Jewish spouses, parents, and children, and as having something to contribute to this embodied Jewish continuity. And I think we need to ask, in the ways we're assessing communities, how are we treating LGBTQ Jewish parents, disabled Jewish parents of color, especially Black Jewish parents, or Jewish parents who are many or all of the above, and also how we're treating people who are not parents. Are we treating Jews with disabilities, Jews of color, disabled Jews, people who are all of the above, as people who could become Jewish parents and whose children would be welcome, and who would be welcome in our parent culture if they did have children? And I think there's also a conversation to be had about how we value people who don't have kids, but there's also a conversation that needs to be had about how we value a wider range of people appropriately as Jewish parents and potential Jewish parents. So some implications about this is that programs for parents need to be both accessible in the disability sense and LGBTQ affirming. So we need to be looking at, do our programs for parents and families take place in accessible spaces? If we make videos about Jewish parenting, are they captioned? Who can parents contact, not just about their children's accessibility needs, but about their own access needs? And what are we doing to send a message that LGBTQ parents and LGBTQ disabled parents are welcome, valued, and seen as part of our community, and people have a legitimate role in Jewish continuity? Another reason this is important is that welcoming LGBTQ parents is a really crucial element in our efforts to welcome Jewish children with disabilities. But often when we have conversations about the psychological space of parents and collaborating with parents, we're often implicitly imagining a heteronormative couple. And not all parents of disabled kids are, straight couples. And in fact, LGBTQ parents are particularly likely to have kids with disabilities because LGBTQ parents are significantly more likely to have adopted older children. So when we're talking about the relationship parents have to their kids' disability in the community, we really need to be mindful of the fact that people's relationship with the community can involve also being gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, or any number of other things. And we need to, if we don't want to put parents in a position where they have to choose between a school that will respect their child and a school that will respect them. We need to build schools that will respect the entire family with as all that they are. LGBTQ parents should not have to tolerate disrespect for themselves or their relationships or their identities in order to get their kids access to Jewish education. We need to value the whole family. Part of valuing the whole family is to remember that parents come in all genders. Not all parents of young children are mothers. Not all kids who have two parents have a mother and a father. Parents can be men, women, non-binary, agender, any other gender. And so we need to be careful about our assumptions and to be welcoming of parents of all genders on equal terms. One way we can do that is by using gender-neutral language to send a welcoming message. For instance, a lot of programs get called Mommy and Me. And if we call a program Mommy and Me, that sends the message that the only parents we're welcoming in that program are mommies. Not all parents of the kids in the age range are mothers. Some of them might be fathers, some of them might have a different identity. So if you can use gender neutral language that gets the message across, it's much more welcoming of a broader range of families, including LGBTQ families. So saying Tat Shabbat, one thing I've seen is bring your own baby, parents and toddlers play group, or any number of other things that describe your program in a way that doesn't assume the gender of the parents who are participating. Similarly, if you use an intake form and it says mother and father, that sends a message about what kind of parents you are and aren't expecting as part of your school. If you say parent one and parent two, that and have room for other important adults, that sends a different message about what kind of community your community is. Saying things to kids like, where's your grown-up, instead of where's your mommy, since not all kids have mommies. Not all kids, mommy is the one who comes with them. And if you ask kids where their grown-up is in a way that respects the fact that different kids have different genders of grown-ups, that sends a much more respectful message to their family. And that matters for people who have one of the identities, and it really matters for people who have both of the identities. So this really could have gone anywhere in this presentation, but a note about pronouns, which I think can be very important to some people. Most people use either she, her, or he, him pronouns. Some people have different pronouns that are more gender neutral, like they, them. My younger sibling uses they, them. Some people use other more gender neutral pronouns like she, her. One of my best friends uses those. And it's really important to respect that. And I've seen often this gets derailed into an argument about whether this is grammatically correct or not. And that's not really important. We're not the grammar police. We're the people who want to build respectful Jewish community that welcomes all of our people. So, when somebody's pronouns are important to them, it's important to respect them. And again, this is particularly important for people who, are both use pronouns that matter to them and are disabled and are Jewish. So thing about pronouns is that some of the things that have been done to try to make a more pronoun-friendly environment can be problematic for disabled people, because not everybody wants to say what their pronouns are. Not everybody wants people to pay close attention to their pronouns. So I think that pressuring people to say their pronouns isn't a good thing, but I think that making sharing pronouns safe, easy, and optional is what we should be striving for. Because it's important to respect people's privacy. It's also important to call people what they want to be called. So one thing that we've seen done at conferences is to make it an optional line on name tags, or for people who are comfortable saying their pronouns to put them in their email signature to show that it's a space in which this can happen. But it can be complicated. I think there's still a conversation about how to best do this. The most important thing is that it's important to respect people's pronouns. It's also important to not put pressure on people to share things they may not be comfortable sharing. So getting back to the issue of sexuality and Jewish continuity, this looms really large in programs that are intended to connect younger Jews, because programs for Jews of a certain age, like maybe teenagers through young professionals, tend to have an agenda of encouraging Jews to form relationships with each other that may later lead to Jewish marriage and physically embodied Jewish continuity in the form of having Jewish children. And so who is and is not welcome and accommodated in programs like summer camp, in programs like Young Professionals Club, in programs like Birthright Israel, says something about who we are and are not seeing as having legitimate sexuality and a legitimate role as part of the Jewish future. So when these programs are not inclusive, it sends a message that is heard and that is consequential for people far beyond a 10-day trip or one particular club or one particular summer, because it shapes identity and it shapes collective identity, and people notice who's in the room, who isn't, who's being treated as part of this community as young Jews who want to connect to each other and who isn't. And it sends a message, and the message we're sending matters. So it's worth really asking ourselves and making sure we have an honest answer to this is, are young Jews with disabilities welcome in programs that are intended in part to facilitate relationships and social connectedness of this type? Are they allowed to date and engage in that type of behavior in the same way, age-appropriate way that others their age are? And is that still true if they're gay, if they're a lesbian, if they're a bisexual, if they're trans, if they're queer, if they have, any number of other identities? Are they still going to be welcome? Are we still going to treat them as part of the Jewish future? And I think that there are a lot of conversations that need to be had about that specifically, but I think that the questions are worth asking. So when disabled young people aren't welcome in the same group as their non-disabled peers, there's a lot more at stake than a 10-day trip, which is why we do it in the first place. It's about who's part of the community and part of Jewish continuity, as much as it's about Israel and as much as it's about any other educational objective. Likewise, camp. And I think that we need to look real closely at how our programs for kids who have been through puberty are structured. Do programs for kids who have been through puberty include kids with and without disabilities on equal terms? Are we comfortable with them having the same types of social connections and really relating to each other as equals? Including all of the things that go on in those programs and all of the things we're cultivating in those programs? Or are we keeping them separate? Are we enforcing different rules? Are we afraid? Related to that, when we talk about consent and when we talk about boundaries and when we talk about consent and boundary education, are we including teenagers with disabilities in those conversations? And if we're not, why not, and how do we fix it? Similarly, when we do programs that are about LGBTQ identity and being affirming, are those programs, if we're doing them ourselves, how are we planning for making sure that are also disability affirming? And if we're bringing in outside speakers, how do we talk to them about making sure that their program is accessible to our participants with disabilities and that it's disability affirming as well as LGBTQ affirming? A related issue to that, is it safe for staff to be out? And out in the sense of a full range of things that people might be closeted about. Can camp counselors who are gay talk about being gay? Can trans camp counselors safely talk about being trans? And can disabled camp counselors safely talk about being disabled? And can people who are more than one of these things talk about that? And again, I mean this in an age-appropriate way. I don't think that counselors should be oversharing or sharing graphic stuff. That would be inappropriate. But I think that we usually know when a counselor's straight. And it's usually made pretty clear because counselors talk about Jewish relationships, connectedness, things like that. And, if kids get the impression in camp that all of the counselors are straight, that's a problem. If campers get the impression that there are no gay or trans or bisexual or queer Jewish adults, that's a problem. If there are no disabled counselors, or disabled counselors are required to be completely silent about their disability, that's a problem. Again, I'm not saying people should overshare. There are conversations that are appropriate and conversations that are not, but people shouldn't have to hide fundamental parts of their identity, because especially in programs where we're trying to create role models and we're trying to create ways to help kids see Jewish adults they could become. Kids need role models, and kids need us to model a community in which it's okay to be gay, it's okay to be a lesbian, it's okay to be trans or queer, it's okay to be disabled, it's okay to be both at the same time. And whoever you are as you grow into Jewish adulthood is an okay, valued, and wanted thing. Kids do better when they have adult role models and where they see adult Jewishness that they can picture themselves in. And again, if we're creating an environment, like say camp, that's designed for kids who might be the only Jewish kids in their school or in their grade, and who need an environment where it's socially normal to be Jewish and it's safe to be Jewish and they're not facing anti-Semitism, those are the kids who most need to be safe and who most need to know that their whole Jewishness is accepted and valued, including their queer Jewishness, disabled queer Jewishness. Because if it's not us, it's not going to be anyone. Jews are Jewish with everything that they are all of the time. There isn't a part that's disabled and a part that's LGBTQ and a part that's Jewish. But people often get pressure to act as though there is. To say like, you know, I'll be safe as a gay or person in gay community. I'll be safe as a disabled person in disabled community. And I'll be safe as a Jew in Jewish community. But they're the same person all the time. And if we don't show up for them as their whole self, no one else will. And, you know, we want to be safe for all of our people. And it's not just about safety. It's also about the fact that everything they are is Jewish, and everything they are has something to bring to the Jewish conversation that our communities really need. Yeah. And as it says in the Passover Haggadah, even if we were all wise, all discerning, all elders, all knowledgeable about the Torah, it would be a commandment upon us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And anyone who adds and tells more and more of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, this is praiseworthy, this is the best. And our stories about going out of Egypt and about being in exile, both in the sense of how we understand the historical Passover story and how we understand the Bible, how we understand ourselves today, we've told more of the stories that are about straight, non-disabled men than we've told about any other group. And we've always been here. Like, Jews with disabilities have been here from the beginning. Queer, lesbian, bisexual, gay, trans Jews have been here since the beginning. People who are both been here since the beginning. And we need to tell those stories too. And we need to bring that into the way that we learn Torah and in the range of experiences that we bring in, because we're told people in every generation, each and every Jewish human being is obligated to see themselves as if they have personally gone out of Egypt, and they need to tell the story about what that means to themselves and their communities. And that means that we need to be able to think about people who are women, gay, queer, trans, disabled, all of the above, coming out of Egypt and having a story to tell that the community needs. Stories we can tell are very much worth telling and needed and necessary. And to give another example of how we really cannot learn Torah properly without the whole community. So if you tell the story of Isaac, tell the story of Isaac and the blessing that he gave to his sons at the end of his life, and how he was ostensibly tricked by having Jacob put wool on his arms and pretend to be his brother. Well, no blind person I know would be fooled by that. And I think that if you listen to the experiences that people have with blindness who really know what it's like to be blind, it changes our understanding of that story. And I've also been wondering lately about the Ruth as it came up on Passover. Ruth, Naomi, when she came back, said, "Don't call me Naomi anymore, but instead call me Mara." And that particular verse is said in a way that's much less gendered than Hebrew normally is. It's a Hebrew verse that sort of elides gendered words much more than would be typically expected. And so I've started to wonder, could we understand that as a trans narrative? Maybe, maybe not, but I think it's a question worth asking. And I think that we all have things to bring to the interpretation of Torah that our communities really need. So at this point, does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. See, Lauren says, I have one comment related to birthright. Okay, go ahead. You actually go ahead and unmute if you'd prefer. Just if you unmute, it will be on the recording. So if you don't want it to be on the recording, type it. If you do want it to be on the recording, unmute.
Hi, really quickly. Thank you so much for this. This was a wonderful presentation. Just one very quick note about birthright to add to what you mentioned about that, which I think is completely on point. Also, the trips that are designed for disabled people send the message that if you're queer and disabled, well, are you going to be welcome there? And also, it's really kind of segregatory. Sorry, that's not the right way to say that word, because we're sending the message that, you know what, we're really part of this community, we're doing this thing, but it's more of a favor than an actual communal integration.
Right. Right, and there's a big difference between having a trip that's for people with disabilities because there's a community of people with disabilities who want a disability-specific trip versus having a trip that's for people with disabilities as an alternative to making the other trips accessible and welcoming. And I think that's part of it too. Is that related to what you're getting at, or am I missing the point?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, and I also think with regards to the both identities thing is that, you know, if the gay trip isn't accessible and the disabled trip isn't LGBTQ affirming, well, you're only one person. So where do you go? Yeah, and so does anyone else have yeah. So okay. So someone asks, I have read more about the disability narrative in stories and less LGBTQ narrative. Where can we learn more about this perspective? So I have a couple of answers to that. One is that Keshet, which is keshetonline.org. Okay. Okay, Lauren, can you remute yourself? Okay, got it. Okay. So, and I will put this link also in the chat. 1 second. So Keshet, which is the Jewish Organization for LGBTQ Equality in Jewish Life, has a lot of great resources on LGBTQ Jewish issues. including a lot of LGBTQ Torah commentary. I would also recommend Rabbi Julia Watzbalzer's work for a perspective that interprets from both LGBTQ and disability perspective simultaneously. Okay, and I see you also have a comment on Daniel, a Keshet staff member here. Yes, we have a lot of resources and our new website is online. Check out Torah queries and search for the gender diversity in sacred texts. There's a lot of really great commentary and interpretation there. And I would also just really love to see, and probably should be working on development of more that bring in both perspectives, because a lot of people are both, and being both has a lot to add to our interpretation and storytelling of Torah. So others have questions, comments, reflections? So one thing I'll add in terms of the overlap between LGBTQ and disability Jewish advocacy is that I've noticed a real difference in the connotations the word inclusion has when it's used in an LGBTQ context versus when inclusion is used in a disability context. I found that in LGBTQ contexts, what inclusion usually means is equality. It means equality, it means bringing in LGBTQ voice. It means building communities in which people are seen and treated as equally Jewish. And it also often means building communities in which there's some regard for the amount of trauma that LGBTQ Jews have often been through, and the need to do some tshuva about that. And I think that that's something that those of us who come more from the disability inclusion perspective should really look to as a model for how to have a conversation about building in more equality. Because I think in the disability context, often inclusion means something we, the Jewish people, are doing for them, the disabled. Like, we are including them. And I think that the LGBTQ model, where inclusion means everybody's equal, we need to value everybody's voice, and we need to build equality and tshuva into our communities, I think that's really necessary across the whole field. And another thing is that has built in that LGBTQ Jewish advocacy has a lot of leadership and people in leadership roles who are themselves LGBTQ, speaking for themselves and for their communities. And I think that we also need a lot more of that in our disability inclusion efforts. We need more disabled voice. We need more disabled people in leadership roles in inclusion efforts. And we need to make sure that we're embodying the principle that in the disability community, what we say is nothing about us without us. Like, if the topic is disability, disabled people need to be at the table. And we need to be at the table not only as people telling our personal stories for other people's edification, but also people who are at the table as experts, as leaders, as people who have power and authority in the conversation. And I think that in any communal inclusion systems change, there's work to be done there. But I also think that the disability inclusion efforts have a lot to learn from LGBTQ inclusion efforts in that regard. And what I would really like the LGBTQ community, I think, could benefit from learning from disability community is that what I really learned from being in disability activist space is that humanity is not something you have to earn. We don't need to make the case that we're people and that we're valuable and that we're, that it's worth including us, because we are people down to the core. And that is not something anyone can ever take away from you. And I think that that's something that we both need in different directions for different reasons, but in great overlap. And I also think the LGBTQ community needs the disabled community because, again, so many LGBTQ families are raising kids with disabilities. And there needs to be a framework for understanding and supporting, like, what does it mean to be an LGBTQ family with, kids with disabilities? How do we create the same spirit of equality for autistic trans kids as we do for neurotypical trans kids within Jewish community? And also, just one time I did a scholar in residence Shabbat at a LGBTQ synagogue, and there were 3 specialty pharmacies within a 5-block radius, which means that the gay community needs something that the disabled community has really urgently, because disabled identity and disabled concepts of dealing with illness and with disabling conditions like that is necessary for people who have them from any source. It's necessary for resisting the kind of dehumanization and deadly dehumanization that we all face. So I think that there are a lot of conversations and cross-pollination between queer inclusion and disabled inclusion efforts. And I really just want to say, in a spirit of to be continued, it's not upon us to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. And there's so many exciting opportunities to keep engaging in the work and to fully honor and celebrate all Jews as God made them and for what they bring to the world needs. So thank you, everyone. To be continued, please reach out if there's a conversation you'd like to continue or a question or comment.